Nothing compares to this. Watching the dawn's light dance across your world's oceans, as the shadows of your mountains retreat towards the peaks. This is what makes a world feel tangible, something more real than a flat, lifeless map. The past year, I've been mastering Gaea, software often overlooked by fantasy cartographers. Now, I'm launching a new tutorial series, project files included, to guide you step by step to these exact results. Because your world doesn't deserve to be drawn, it deserves to be seen. Hey everyone, welcome to KILROY'S Kartography. Today, we're kicking off a brand new series on how to create visually realistic fantasy maps. And I want to talk about that phrase, visual realism. See, when we talk about realism, there are two sides. There's the scientific side, getting the plate tectonics, the geology, the climate prediction perfectly correct. That's awesome, but it's a massive undertaking. Then there's the visual side, making sure the land and the mountains simply look realistic. Do the coasts look like they've been eroded? Do the mountains look carved by ice and wind? We are focusing 100% on the visuals. And this brings me to the most important point of this entire video. Your starting point only needs to be a rough guide. So many people get stuck planning their world, thinking that they need to be a scientist. You don't. We're going to use powerful software to add realistic details later. But it's completely up to you how you start. For example, option 1, just go for it. Seriously, embrace the mistakes, embrace the cliches. We will use techniques to make any coastline or mountain range look more realistic, even if the placement is a little off. Option 2, use a tool like Rock 3. It's free and it's a great way to generate a starting height map and climate. Gives you everything that you need. So who cares if the tectonics aren't quite perfect? Option 3, go analog. Follow a great pen and paper guide, like the ones from Madeline James World Builds, to get a starting map. Option 4, go deep. If you love the science, follow an in-depth guide from Artifactian or the World Building Pasta blog. You'll follow them all the way, right up until you get to the erosion step, because that's where we take over. No matter which starting point you choose, the script from here is the same. This workflow is our secret weapon. We'll start by creating a basic height map in Photoshop. This is just a grayscale image, black as the ocean, and we'll use brushes to paint in our grained landmasses and our white mountains. Then comes the magic. This is Gaea. We bring our lumpy, simple map in here, and we use Gaea's powerful nodes to simulate decades of realistic erosion and sedimentation. This is what carves out the canyons, creates the jagged peaks, and makes the terrain visually stunning. But here's the real secret. Gaea doesn't just do shape, it does texture. Gaea can detect all the information about our new terrain. The slope, the flow of water, where soil would be, the peaks, and it uses that to build a realistic color map. It's not artistic talent, it's simulation. So that's the plan. That's the overview. We're at base camp and now we can see the summit. And you know what? There's no point in waiting. We're going to start the ascent right now. The very first thing we need to do is create our rough height map. This is the foundation that everything else is built on. Now, you can generate maps completely procedurally. In fact, I've got my own method for doing that, which I'll link in the description. I've often found myself wanting more artistic control. The generated mountain ranges were good, but they lacked that final, believable touch. My search for a better way led me to the work of a brilliant digital artist, Joshua Goff. Joshua has perfected a method of creating this rough height map right in Photoshop, using specialized brushes and some really clever tricks to build a coherent and stunningly realistic foundation. By incorporating his approach into my Gaea workflow, I've found it just adds a whole new level of realism. Now, This is a really important point. This is where our workflows diverge. I take this Heightmap and bring it into Gaea, which is what this series is all about. Josh, however, continues his process in Wilbur and Photoshop to create his final maps. His maps are absolutely incredible, and they show the insane artistic control his method gives you. If you're interested in creating high-resolution maps without ever needing a Gaea license, I would recommend his full tutorial. It's on his Patreon and I'll link it below. With his permission, this video is based on the initial Heightmap creation section of his process, so a massive shout out to Joshua for letting us build upon his work. Okay, let's get set up. To follow along, you're going to need two things: Photoshop, or GIMP, but Photoshop is ideal, and a set of specialized brushes. You have a few options for the brushes. Option 1, and this is my recommended way, the best option is to actually just purchase Joshua's brush pack or his full tutorial, which includes the brush pack. You'll get a much greater variety, and I have to say Josh's brushes seem to be based on real-world Heightmap data, which just gives that extra level of realism. The links are in the description. Option 2, there are some free samples. If you're not ready to spend any money, Josh has kindly provided some free samples on his Patreon, so you would still be able to follow along. Option 3, the free alternative, there's another great free option, is to follow the tutorials from Short Valley Hiker. I'll provide a link to his videos, but he provides his brushes for free and manages still to get really nice results. And finally, if you want to just put in the time, option 4 is the DIY route, where you can create your own brushes. I have a guide on my blog. Okay, got your brushes? Got Photoshop open? All right, let's make a continent. And you know what? Rather than me just re-explaining his process, who better to teach this segment than the person who mastered it? Joshua has very kindly allowed me to include this part of his tutorial directly in my video. It's an incredibly generous move. So again, please go check out his Patreon, which I have linked below. So for this next critical part, I'm going to hand you over to the man himself. Get ready to take notes. This is when the magic really starts. Take it away, Josh.
Hi everyone, we're going to get straight to the map making, but first I wanted to say thank you. You're not stupid, you know this is a pre-recorded intro, so there's no way I can properly thank you personally, but just know that by subscribing to this tutorial, you are keeping a roof over my head and food on my table, so thank you so much. Now, would you believe me that we can go from this to this, all in the same project? Well, I'm going to guess that you can. Well, over the course of this tutorial, I'm going to take you from the beginning to the end of my entire map making process, covering everything from building your height maps, making erosion simulations, colouring in your biomes, and all the other little details that you might find on a map. Everything you need to follow this tutorial is inside the asset pack provided with the video, so all you need to do is download and install them beforehand. Other than that, you'll need a copy of Photoshop, legit or otherwise. Other than that, all you need is Wilbur and GIMP. Quick little disclaimer before we begin, this tutorial is designed to be accessible to both beginners and experts, so for those of you who are a bit more familiar with these tools, just consider I'm taking this slowly so that everyone has a fair chance to catch up. Okay then, I don't think anything else needs saying. Let's go! Starting off in Photoshop, we're going to set up our document at a good size. For this tutorial I'm focusing only on one continent, so a square 1:1 canvas will do. On these projects, I'd normally work at around 20,000 pixels in height and width, but in the interest of time, I'm working on a 5,000 pixel square. You'll want to change these numbers based on your personal needs, but I'd recommend this size as a minimum. Make sure your canvas is set to RGB and 72 dpi, unless you're planning to print it off later, in which case you could go for 300 dpi. Okay, in our blank document, let's make a new layer by clicking that little plus icon down here in the bottom right toolbar. Then, with the brush tool, which we can either select manually or by hitting B on the keyboard, I'm going to right click to open the brush menu and select a simple hard round brush from the defaults. I'll scale this down by holding the Alt key and right mouse button while dragging the mouse to the left, and then I'll simply left click to pop a nice big gaping void on this blank layer. This humble black hole will be the fabric of our continent. Of course, it's important to know that this experimental technique is for those of you who maybe haven't decided a landmass shape yet, so if you've already got your world drawn and you know what it looks like, then just skip to the timestamp on screen now. To morph this black hole into the rough shape of our continent, let's navigate to the smudge tool over here in the left toolbar. If you can't see it, it's usually partnered with the blur and sharpen tools. All you need to do is find one of those, click and hold on it, and that tool should show you all three options. Now make sure the finger painting option is unchecked, and we'll right click to open the brush menu and choose a brush from the pack you've downloaded. I'm going to choose Cloud 2. What we need to do now is head over to the brush settings menu, which if you can't see on your right hand toolbar, you can make it visible by going to Window, Brush Settings. Now in the brush settings menu, I'm going to check Shape Dynamics and then click on that submenu itself. I'll increase the size jitter to around 30% and angle jitter to 100%, and then check both Flip X and Flip Y jitters. These settings tell Photoshop to flip and rotate the brush every time you click your mouse or with your stylus, and this just makes sure there's no uniformity there. We'll be using this throughout the entire map making process, so just get used to it now, play around with the settings and see what works for you. Now with these settings applied, let's start clicking and dragging the smudge tool around the borders of the black hole as if gravity itself has decided to fight back. Using this, we'll drag it into the vague shape of a landmass. You can take as much time with this as you need, and remember you can change the brush size by Alt right-clicking and dragging your mouse to make smaller or larger manipulations. Just note that depending on the size of your document and of course the power behind the system running Photoshop, you might notice a lot of lag with the smudge tool. So for instance, you might see it swimming behind your mouse after a few seconds, and this can go on for some minutes depending on how large your movements are with the mouse. But I promise it will happen, just be patient and let it run. If you get to a certain point and it's just not working for you, you can always navigate to Filter, Liquefy, and use that to manipulate the shape too. Just make sure that you check your backdrop settings allow you to see what you're doing. In my case, I just had to reduce the opacity to 0. Using the tools provided, you can stretch, bloat, pinch, or rotate parts of the image. Quick tip, you can also use the square bracket keys to increase and decrease your brush size incrementally. This applies to any brush tool in Photoshop. Once you're a bit happier with the shape, you can always go back to the smudge tool and make your final adjustments. And if you're wondering about the not very defined coastlines, don't worry, we'll address that shortly. And now that we've made this nice puddle of oil, we can clean up the coastline a bit by using a technique I've found to make very dynamic shapes. Let's create a threshold adjustment layer by clicking the half shaded circle icon here in the layers panel, and immediately you can see how smooth those coastlines look. If we click and drag the handle up here in the threshold histogram display, the coastline moves in and out. On the left side are our darker areas of the image and the lighter areas on the right. This allows us to clip the black level to a certain point based on the grey tones created when we smudged and smeared the black hole. I'm going to set the handle on the low end somewhere that makes the coastlines edgy and less round. If we zoom in, however, you can see the reality of this effect, and this is something we'll need to iron out. In order to fix this, let's create a stamp visible layer, which is simply a new layer that contains everything currently visible in the document. To do this, we can use the contortionist's favourite shortcut, Ctrl-Alt-Shift-E, or if you're on a Mac, Command-Option-Shift-E. So let's navigate to Filter, Filter Gallery, and wait for the image to load. Your default filters will be different to mine based on what you've used before, but all we need here is the stamp filter from the sketch folder in the menu, and just make sure it's turned on. If we drag the preview over to the coastline, we can get a better idea of what that's doing. With the light/dark balance set to 25 and the smoothness to 1, we can eliminate that noisy edge created by the threshold adjustment while keeping the rough texture. And now we have our coastline. Now, whether you're going for realism or pure fantasy, don't forget that a lot of Earth's coastlines are relatively smooth. I know it's tempting to make jagged, pointy coastlines everywhere just because it sometimes looks cooler, but often having these smoother coastlines in areas, especially where your ocean currents will be sweeping along the landmass, could just add to that photorealism. Zooming to fit with Ctrl or Command 0, let's navigate to Select, Color Range, and select the white parts of the image with the eyedropper tool. You can do this with the Magic Wand tool if you'd rather, but I find this is a way more accurate way of doing it. Let's drag the fuzziness slider to full to make sure all of the white is selected. Click OK, and then hit backspace to delete those areas from this layer, giving us back our landmass shape on a transparent background. We can then deselect with Ctrl or Command D. Now, we don't have any use for that threshold adjustment layer anymore, so we can delete that entirely. If we play with the opacity of the original smudgy landmass layer, we can keep this around as a potential shelf for our ocean. At this point, I'm going to start renaming the layers by double-clicking on their names just to keep organised. I'll turn off the original layer as we don't need it right now, but it may come in handy later. I want to add a little bit more detail to this landmass as it's looking a bit bare at the moment. So I'll add another layer above the new landmass layer, and on this one I'm going to activate the pencil tool from the left toolbar. You can find this the very same way we found the smudge tool, just in the brush entry. Alternatively, you can hit B on the keyboard and then Shift B until it cycles to the pencil tool. So the reason we're using the pencil tool instead of the brush tool is because the pencil has a sort of hard edge to it where the pixels aren't faded, whereas with the brush tool you get what's called anti-aliasing, which is designed to smooth out curves, but right now we need the sharp edges to define a really clear coastline. I'm going to use a variety of the terrain brushes provided in the asset pack to add details we couldn't have otherwise done in the smudge step. How and where you do this is up to you, but consider using some of the mountain stencils to add fjords and more generic terrain stencils to add islets and craggy headlands where your seas might be a bit rougher. Don't forget to check the shape dynamics box and apply the same settings we used earlier. Size jitter to 30%ish, angle jitter to 100%, and check the flip X and flip Y boxes. This will ensure you don't have too many repeating patterns. Side note, but an important one, if you want to swap between stencils while you're doing this, just make sure you do it from the brush settings menu and not the one in the top left. The reason for this is if you use the top left menu or when you right click to bring up the brush menu, what will happen is all the settings you've just applied to that brush will be deleted. So if you do it via the brush settings menu instead, you'll apply those settings to each and every stencil that you use from that point onward. This step takes a lot of experimentation, so take your time and flip back and forth with Ctrl or Command Z to undo a step you aren't happy with. I'd recommend using my pre-built landmass shape stencils in the asset pack to add more interesting shapes to the ones we've already created. Once you're happy, you can select both the current layer and your landmass layer, right-click and select Merge Layers, and this will join them together as one. Now you can rename this if you need to. Don't forget to save the project at this point. Please, you do not want to have to do this bit again. And this is the shape I landed on, and this is after adding another section to the bottom right with one of my pre-built landmass brushes. I just think it looks a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more interesting to the eye. With our final landmass shape prepared, we're ready to start planning our mountain ranges. Now, I'm not going to go over the how and why of mountains too much here. If you want all that information, then it's already on the internet for free. Just check YouTube about tectonic movements and how mountains are formed. But if I was to break it down for you, it's essentially the movement of two tectonic plates moving against each other. One will always sink under while the other goes over, crumpling up the ground, which will make a steep side and a shallow side to the mountains. So take that into account when you're making your maps just to sell that photorealism. With the default soft round brush and a distinguishable colour like red, let's start drawing out the guidelines for where we want the mountains. Let's turn the flow setting on the top toolbar to something like 6%, just so the brightness doesn't build too quickly. Let's add a new layer and call it Guides. And then with the Alt or Option key held down, let's hover the cursor over the line between that layer and the landmass layer below it until a box and arrow icon appears, and then left click. This creates a clipping mask, which means anything we paint in the guides layer will only appear within the confines of the landmass layer. From here, I'm just sketching where I think my mountains would form based on the tectonic movements I've decided for this continent. The more I brush over areas, the brighter the red gets thanks to the low flow setting. This will show me later where the taller mountains are. On this first main ridge, I'm imagining that the southern part of the landmass has pushed upwards and crashed into the north side, creating a Himalayan-style mountain range at the join. I took inspiration from just that, the way the Indian subcontinent slammed into the Eurasian continent. It's important to remember at this stage that your map is your own. Don't let anybody tell you that it's wrong or that it should be done a different way. If you just want your map to look a certain way because of the rule of cool, and you like it, it looks aesthetically pleasing to you, then that's totally valid. But on the same side, if you're going for geographic realism, good for you, go for it. Go and do the research you need to do to find out how to make that completely accurate. But either way, anything you do in a map making session is yours. Own it. I'm making sure to change my brush size regularly during the sketching phase to emulate the smaller ridges and larger plateaus. Don't worry though, this is just a sketch. If you're doing an entire world at once, bear in mind that this will take a lot of time to plan out properly. Don't rush, just trust the process and enjoy watching your world take shape. After all, we need to make it perfect for those tiny imaginary people to live on it. Now it's time to make our height map, but first we need to make a nice texture for our mountains to sit on. And this will be like the first stage of our height map. If you're not sure what a height map is, then it's basically a grayscale image that depicts height from black to white values. And essentially anything black is low and anything white is high. It's as simple as that. We're going to preview this in faux 3D style first just to make sure that it looks pleasing to the eye. Now that I'm happy with my guides, I'm going to add a solid colour adjustment layer from the same menu as the threshold adjustment from earlier and fill it with a blue colour. This layer can sit beneath our landmass layer. This specific colour is up to you, but if you want to match mine, then you can use the hex code on screen or pick it from the swatches provided in the asset pack. Once again, if you can't see the swatches menu, you can navigate to Window, Swatches to activate it.
This step isn't actually necessary, it's just nicer to look at blue than white at this point.
So it's time to start making our terrain textures. From here, I'm going to hide my guides layer by clicking the eye icon, as we'll need it later. Then I'm going to duplicate the landmass layer by holding Alt or Option while dragging that layer to the top of the layer stack. Next, I'll make an active selection of the landmass by Control or Command clicking the layer thumbnail. Then navigate to Edit, Fill, and choosing 50% grey as the contents, leaving everything else to default. This will quite literally fill that selection with a completely neutral grey, which will be our base tone to apply textures to. Otherwise it'd be too hard to see anything on top of black. With our new grey layer, we can hide the black landmass layer and rename this one to Terrain Plate, or something you'll remember. I'll hide this one to use later, then make a new layer underneath and do the same edit, fill steps as before, just without making a selection first. This will fill the entire canvas with that neutral grey, and we'll just call this one Terrain. On the bottom right toolbar, let's select the little rectangle with a hole in it, and this will add a mask to this layer. This is where we'll create the first layer of our height map. Then double click on the layer somewhere not directly over the text, and the layer styles menu should appear. I'll click on Styles, then Basics, and choose the first setting to reset everything to defaults. Then check the Bevel and Emboss option, which will add a lighted 3D edge to the layer. If we click on that option, a sub-menu comes up and we can start tweaking the settings to best display the texture we're going to make. Now, these settings won't actually matter in the final result, but consider this a secondary sketching phase where we at least want it to feel nice to look at. Change the technique to Chisel Soft, the depth to 1000, size to 1, angle to 135 degrees. This is the typical direction of sunlight in maps. And then leave the rest as it is for now. You can always edit these later. When you click OK, nothing much will have happened because we need to manually paint the texture using the brushes in the asset pack. Don't worry though, this layer style we've just applied will do the magic. We just need to show the magic where to happen. Select your brush tool with B, ensuring you're no longer using the pencil tool, and head over to the brush settings menu. I'm going to choose one of the terrain brushes, in this instance Terrain 6, and apply the brush settings we've been using before. I'll turn the flow back up to 100%, and then with black as my foreground colour, I'm going to start chopping up the terrain layer. You can reset your colours by hitting D on the keyboard. There's no right way to do this bit, just make individual clicks and switch between black and white to remove or add depth to the texture. Feel free to change stencils from the brush settings menu and combine different textures together. Try to avoid having any perfectly flat areas of grey too. Remember to check that you're painting in the layer mask and not the layer itself. You can check this by looking at where the box corners are on the layer thumbnail. Painting in the layer will just change the colour, which isn't part of this step. At this point, we can turn down the layer fill percentage to 0 on this layer, which will hide the grey but not the 3D effect. Then we can just move this layer above the terrain plate layer and we can start to get an idea of how the ground texture looks. Now, with the layer mask selected, navigate to Filter, Liquefy, and this will bring up a grayscale preview of your mask. And if you go down to the backdrop settings, you can select your terrain plate layer in the Use drop-down menu. Turn the opacity up to preview the landmass in front of the mask. This will let you be a little bit more accurate. Then, with the warp tool, we can start pushing the texture around to mimic the effects of tectonic movement. For instance, I can push parts of the ground to look as though they've moved with the mountains. If you need to, you can adjust the brush tool options in the top right to change the sensitivity of the tool you're using. You don't have to do this step, but I found it really helps sell the realism.
Fun tip, the bloat tool is a great way to emulate craters.
When you're happy, click OK, and then we'll want to delete the texture from the ocean. To do this, make an active selection of the landmass by Control or Command clicking the thumbnail of that layer. Invert the selection by either navigating to Select, Inverse, or by using the shortcut Control or Command Shift I, then hit backspace. This will remove all the grey pixels in the ocean and you should have a textured layer in the shape of your landmass. Deselect with Control or Command D. If we zoom in now, we can see that some of those areas of the coastline have sheer cliffs made by the deletion we just did. To fix this, grab a new brush stencil and reduce the size so that we can clean up those harsh edges. Painting in the terrain mask with black, I'm going to selectively remove the worst of those edges but leave some of the cliff faces in for variety. The aim here is to make sure nothing looks particularly ugly. Some areas like fjords can stay as they are, as they're typically known for the steep slopes in reality. Now, in some areas you'll likely find the flat grey that I mentioned earlier. This will look strange in the final height map, so to adjust that we need to add some texture to just those spots. If we enter the mask preview by Alt or Option clicking on the mask thumbnail, we can see that that area is pure white, hence the flatness of the 3D effect. To fix this, we need to paint over that area not with black, but with a slightly darker grey. However, we need it to only apply to parts of the image that are brighter than the grey that we select. So if we navigate to the Mode drop-down menu on the top toolbar of the brush tool, we can change the mode to Darken. This will essentially tell Photoshop to only paint on areas that are brighter than the colour we've chosen to paint with. In this instance, the brush won't appear on anything below its current brightness value. This helps to keep the adjustment to a minimum. We can leave the mask preview by clicking on the layer thumbnail. Once you're done, make sure you reset the brush mode to normal. Now that we have a ground texture, we need to start thinking about the mountains, and the first thing to do is exaggerate the ground texture where the mountains are and lessen it where they aren't.
If that made sense.
Luckily, we saved a handy guide layer for our mountains earlier just down here above the original land plate layer. So if we Control or Command click the layer thumbnail, we can make an active selection of those rough mountain areas. Making sure we've still got the terrain layer mask selected, let's invert the active selection with Control or Command Shift I so that everything but the mountain areas are highlighted. Alt or Option click on the layer mask thumbnail to preview the mask, just so we can actually see what we're doing here. Hit Control or Command L to bring up a levels adjustment and pull the white output slider to the left to see what happens. As we drag the slider to the left, the white level of the image in that selection darkens, but we only want to make a small adjustment here. Anything too extreme will completely remove the texture we've just spent time creating, so somewhere around 170-180 works just fine in my case.
Remember, many small adjustments over a long time will work better in your favour than one large adjustment all of a sudden.
Let's deselect with Control or Command D and click out of the mask preview just to see what difference that's made. At this point, you might not think that's made much of a difference, but that's really what we want for this stage. Let's make another selection of that guide layer and then click back into the terrain layer mask to make another adjustment. This time we're going to change the levels of the mountain areas. Hit Control or Command L again to bring up the levels, then drag the highlight slider to the left. This will boost the white levels in those areas and make them look like higher elevations. Make sure you just drag the slider to where the histogram starts climbing here. If you go any further left, then you'll get the clipping problem that we fixed earlier. After that, we can bring the black output slider to the right, which will lift the shadows in those areas to better sell the idea that the ground level is higher. A value of 100 should be fine in this case. Spend a bit of time going in and out of the levels adjustment and play around until your high elevations start to look more prominent. Again, we don't want to lose any texture information in our mask, so take it slow, zoom in and out and undo steps if you're not happy. If we click and drag the guide layer to the top, we can see those elevations a little better.
Alright, here we go. It's time to bring in the big guns, that being the mountains.
First of all, let's make a new layer on top of the terrain layer and fill it with 50% grey like we did earlier. I'm just going to turn on my guides layer and reduce its opacity so that I know roughly what shapes I need to fill in. Now we need the same faux 3D effect as the terrain layer, so instead of manually inputting those settings, we can hold the Alt or Option key on the keyboard and click and drag the FX marker onto our new layer. This will copy and paste those settings for us. Of course, nothing will happen just yet as we need to work in a mask, so let's add that now from the bottom toolbar. Click on the mask thumbnail and then hit Control or Command I to invert it to black, and we're ready to finally add those mountains. Just to concentrate on what I'm doing, I'm going to temporarily hide the terrain layer just so things are a bit easier to see. Then with the brush tool activated, let's choose one of those many mountain stencils in the pack.
It might be worth just testing a few of these to get a sense of their scale first, as some of them will be small and large stencils. Try and remember not to scale them up from their maximum default size, as this will introduce pixelation, but feel free to shrink them down if you want to.
Quick tip, the number displayed on the stencil thumbnail tells you how many pixels the brush takes up at its largest dimension, so bear that in mind when you're using them. Similarly to how we did the terrain texture, make sure you've got the new layer mask selected and then paint with white at 100% opacity and flow to bring in the first mountain shape. I often paint and then undo a few times so that the random brush direction matches the line of my planned mountains. Once we've got the first stencil in place, we need to add more shapes and somehow unify them as one. But if we just add more and more to the existing shape, then all we'll get is a jumble of noise that eventually clips when the white values stack on top of each other.
Don't worry though, this doesn't mean we need to make a new layer every single time we put a mountain stencil down. We just need to be a bit more selective. Now, this is a technique that I tried out once before, and while it is a lot more time consuming, there is not a single map that I've made in the last year that doesn't use this method. It just looks so much better in the final result.
Let's Control or Command click the new layer mask thumbnail to make an active selection of the current contents, that being this first mountain shape. Invert that selection with Control or Command Shift I, and then you'll see that anything we paint in this mask will only affect the areas outside of the current mountain shape, avoiding that annoying overlap. As you can see, while this shape makes no logical sense, it hasn't stacked or clipped.
Now bear in mind, you will have to do this select invert selection step every single time you put a new stencil down, and while that does take so much more time, just focus on taking your time, making those blends really seamless, and it will put you leagues beyond an amateur level.
Like I said before, we want to introduce a new shape with every click, so let's select a new stencil, scale it down with the left square bracket key, and rotate it with the left or right arrow keys to make a fine adjustment. Try to line it up according to your guides and then click when you're ready. Deselect with Ctrl or Command D and then begin the selection process again. Just double check you're always painting in the layer mask and not the layer contents itself. That should still remain grey by the end. I'm going to zip into time-lapse mode here, but as my continent takes shape, don't worry about perfect neatness right now. There will inevitably be some weird offshoots in your mountain ranges, but that's for us to clean up later. This step always takes a long time, so especially if you're like me, you're very particular about the way you want your world to look, so don't rush and take regular breaks. Now at this point my mountain range is starting to look good, but it's not quite lining up with my guide, so instead of redoing it, I'm just going to use a tool not really thought of when it comes to map making. First of all though, I need to make a loose active selection of the area I want to adjust with the lasso tool, making sure I'm drawing it from the mask. I'm not worried about an accurate selection here, just large enough to encompass all the height data in the affected area. Then I'll navigate to Edit, Puppet Warp, and you'll see a mesh overlay covering that area. I can manually add what we call anchors to certain points of that selection, in this case places I want to alter the shape with. The amount of anchors and where you place them depends entirely on how your mountains need to be shifted, but I'm just using enough to lock certain parts in place while I move others. Moving individual anchors will allow me to change the direction of the selected mountain range to better fit the tectonics. Again, don't go crazy with this stage as you can make some pretty strange shapes.
But if that's what you're going for, then absolutely do go crazy.
Then it's just a case of doing all these steps over and over until you've constructed a world you're happy with. Keep flipping between brushes, making sure that you've got the same brush settings that we've been using for the tutorial. If you want to erase parts of the mountains, just switch your foreground colour to black by hitting X on the keyboard and click a few times over the areas you want removing. This will erase the mountains with a more natural feel. One thing you might come to notice over time is that all your mountain ranges appear to reach the same elevation, which just doesn't happen in real life. So to change this, preview the mask by Alt or Option clicking the mask thumbnail and making lasso selections of ranges we want to lift or lower, then hitting Ctrl or Command L to bring up a levels adjustment, and pulling the white output slider to the left. Do this to whatever degree works best for you, but all we're looking for here is variety. Of course, mountain ranges don't all just reach a maximum height uniformly, so we need to vary the heights within the individual mountain ranges. To do this, make selections based on where you think the ranges need to fall or rise, then navigate to the Select and Mask button on the top toolbar. This will solo that selection and allow you to make changes to it with a series of sliders on the right. Obviously, we don't want our mountains to suddenly drop off in hard lines, we want them to gradually change. So the only slider we'll need for this is the feather slider, and we can just drag that until we get a gradual fade. When we click OK, that feathered selection will replace our old one, and we can make a levels adjustment to that area, and we'll get a much more natural shift in elevation. Don't be afraid to boost the highlights in some areas to increase the peaks. Do this until you have a convincing flow between your mountain ranges, and you should end up with something like this.
So we've got our terrain layer and our mountain layer, and while we've got some variation in the mountain layer, we need to get some variation in the terrain layer to better blend them. If you're keeping up.
If we pop into our terrain layer mask by Alt or Option clicking the mask thumbnail, we can see the gradual increase in brightness towards the mountains, which is great, but we've also got a lot of flat grey values that don't really change around the low-lying areas. To deal with this, we need to do something similar to the last step with the mountains, but it will be easier and less uniform to paint on the contrast rather than making feathered selections. So going back into the brush settings menu, we can select any stencil. In my case, I'm going to go for one of the cloud brushes. Keeping the same settings as before, I'm only going to change the spacing percentage in the brush tip shape window. This will allow me to click and drag the mouse around without making drastic, sudden changes to the contrast. Thing is, if we just start painting on the mask, the contrast won't change. All we'll do is, well, quite literally paint on it and replace all the work we did earlier. So instead, we need to navigate to the top toolbar while the brush tool is activated and switch the mode to overlay.
If you want to know how these modes work, just head over to YouTube. There's plenty of tutorials already available for free on how layer blend modes and brush blend modes work.
I'll turn the flow right down below 10% to minimise the intensity of the brush, and then with the mask preview open, I'll start randomly increasing the levels in different spots to break up the flat greys. Don't go too crazy with this. Once again, we just need a bit of variety. It's important to note that these variations will later affect the course of your rivers, so bear that in mind. If you prefer, you can come out of the mask preview and just use the textured view to see how much or how little the brush is affecting your terrain. Remember, when you click out of the mask preview, you need to left click on the mask thumbnail again to make sure that your brush is only affecting that. You can also switch to black and slightly reduce certain areas, especially if you want to emphasize a steep side of the mountain range or a rift valley. When you're happy with all your textures and mountains, make an active selection of your landmass shape. Hit D on the keyboard to reset your foreground and background colors. Invert the selection with Ctrl or Command Shift I, and fill it with black with Ctrl or Command Backspace. On Mac, this shortcut might be Alt Backspace, but just give it a try and see what works. This will restrict the ground texture to the confines of your landmass. So do the same for the mountains layer, and don't forget to delete the grey contents of the mountain layer with the same selection, hitting Backspace.
Now at this stage we're ready to prep our height map for the erosion and river stage, but sometimes I like to switch up the pace a bit and focus on something else before coming back to that. This change in perspective can help you get new ideas and just see your world a bit differently. And I promise that once we've done this bit, this will be the end of the planning phase.
In this instance, I decided to prepare the Continental shelf around the landmass. We've been working with monochrome for a while now, and sometimes it's easy to glaze over and lose focus, so let's work with colour for a little bit. To make the shelf, turn on the original land plate layer and duplicate it, either with the shortcut Ctrl or Command J, or by dragging the layer down to the plus symbol on the bottom toolbar. Rename it Shelf Plate. We can drag this layer underneath and turn off the land plate layer. Now you might have already done this stage much earlier when we initially designed the landmass shape, but if like me you've changed the landmass shape quite a bit, you'll need to do this part. Take our old friend smudge tool in the left toolbar and start dragging and smearing with different brush sizes to create an uneven halo around the landmass. These represent the shallow areas of your water before they drop off into the deeper ocean. Use this stage to suggest how your continent has moved over the millennia, adding larger smears where the movement is more obvious, shorter ones where the continent has settled more recently. Try not to get an even shelf all the way around. It doesn't really matter too much how detailed you go with this, but a little bit of thought into these aspects will further sell the realistic feel of your world. When you're happy with the final shelf outline, make a new solid colour adjustment layer above the original blue one. Then using the swatch menu, we can choose the lighter blue of the presets in my asset pack, and then assign the darker one to the first solid colour layer. Next, make an active selection of the shelf plate layer, click on the lighter blue solid colour layer's mask, hit Ctrl or Command Shift I to invert the selection, and then fill it with black to hide it. Turn off the shelf plate layer and you'll now see the lighter blue take that shape. We'll add the effects to this later, but we've finished the planning phase.
In this next phase we'll be taking our rough height map into a program called Wilbur, which will calculate all of our erosion patterns and river systems on its own. But if you are planning to do your rivers manually, then this entire next stage might be completely useless to you. Now I really would recommend doing it this way, simply because a lot of the work is taken out of your hands and you'll get a very, very realistic result because it's all based on the data you provide it. But if you don't want to do it, that's fine. Just skip to the timestamp on screen.
Back in Photoshop, we need to export both our terrain and mountain height maps as one file. That way Wilbur can calculate erosion and rivers accurately. So let's open up the terrain mask preview by Alt or Option clicking the mask thumbnail. Hit Ctrl or Command A to select all, then Ctrl or Command C to copy. Make a new document either with the File menu or by the shortcut Ctrl or Command N, and you'll see that the width and height are already set to our map size thanks to what we've just copied. Change the color mode to RGB just so that we have access to all the adjustment layers, and click OK. Paste with Ctrl or Command V, and then repeat with the Mountains mask. You should end up with a new document with 2 Heightmap layers inside it. Of course, the issue is here that we need to blend the 2 Heightmaps together, but to make an accurate selection of the mountains would be pretty hard, right? Actually, no, all we need to do is navigate to Select, Color Range, and use the eyedropper tool to sample the areas of this layer we know to be black. Then, if we increase the fuzziness slider, Photoshop will begin selecting more into the grey tones. The white area in the preview is what will be selected, and the black will remain unselected. I'm going to put the slider to around 150 just to keep a nice balanced contrast between the selection border, and now I have a decent selection around the mountains. Hitting backspace will delete all the information we selected, leaving us with the mountain ranges on a transparent layer. Deselect with Ctrl or Command D. One thing to keep in mind is that both our terrain and mountain height maps have brightness values spreading from black to white, so we need to limit the terrain height map to the lowest brightness value inside the mountains height map. Otherwise, some of our mountains will look like they've been inverted. To fix this, let's click on our first height map layer, it being the terrain layer, and add an exposure adjustment layer from the toolbar down here. Let's drag the exposure slider to the left until the brightest part of the terrain height map is equal to the darkest part of the mountains height map. You'll start to see then why this is so important. Now we have a gradual climb from black to pure white. Just go around your map double checking there are no overlaps. Let's bring a bit more variety to the terrain just like we did earlier. Click on the exposure adjustment mask, grab a soft round brush with black as the foreground colour and set the opacity of the brush to 30ish%. And gently raise some of the underexposed parts in random areas. Try to avoid areas directly around your mountains. Now, if like me, you think your brushwork has made the brightness look too extreme, you can adjust the mask density slider to lessen the effect. This window is visible if you click on the adjustment layer mask. A value of 50% is enough in my case. Save this image with Ctrl or Command S and select JPEG or PNG, depending on your preference, and then name it something like heightmap_rough.
And we're back. Just wow. A massive thank you to Joshua for that. As you can see, we now have this absolutely incredibly detailed and realistic looking height map. Look at this. The mountain ranges, they feel natural, the foothills blended perfectly, and it's just really a fantastic foundation. Now, as we've discussed, if you were following Josh's full tutorial, you would be heading over to Wilbur from here. But for us, this is where we take our detour. It's time to take this foundation and unleash the power of Gaea. But for that, we'll have to wait for the next video. So if you aren't already, please make sure you're subscribed and keep an eye out for the next video where we'll really unleash the full power of Gaea.